name's Harriet, and I'm coming back after a couple of years of not making videos about controversial anime topics, and I'm here to talk to you about a controversial anime topic. Mostly because this time I'm kind of shocked that this show was so positively received that anyone criticizing it online is basically marching themselves to the stocks. So here we go. I watched Oshi no Ko, which was being lauded last year as like an instant classic, and I'm gonna be honest, I didn't like it that much. Now, to preface this, I was very much primed to enjoy this show. I love Kaguya-sama. I love a good murder mystery thriller. All of the technical aspects are really on point. The animation is gorgeous and clean, and the OP is insanely catchy. And there are many, many things that I enjoyed about the show. I think it occasionally has some really good writing about the entertainment industry, and I think the idea at its core is really fascinating. I think the fact that I can see what makes the show good is also what makes it really frustrating for me, because the show itself seems unaware of its own good qualities. After the jaw-dropping first episode, which I have many thoughts on, both good and bad, the show really seems to entirely lose its own plot. No matter how you feel about the first episode, I don't understand how that isn't seen widely as being frustrating. I also want to say, as a warning, I have not read the manga. This is based entirely on my experience with the 11-episode first season. If you think that there's something about the manga that would really make me change my tune, feel free to let me know about it in the comments. To start with, I'm going to do a quick recap of the show for those who haven't seen it, or to those who are a little bit fuzzy. I am going to warn you, I'm going to get into major spoiler territory pretty quickly, so if you're at all curious about the show, I would say to at least watch the first episode, because I think that at least is worth watching blind, and then you can make up your own mind from there. So to those of you who are still with me, Oshi no Ko is about a teenage idol named Ai Hoshino. As she's achieving the beginnings of stardom, she becomes pregnant and secretly has twin children. Our protagonist is not in fact Ai, but her doctor, who's a big fan of her as an idol. The doctor attempts to defend Ai from a stalker on the night she's due to give birth, but is then subsequently murdered by that stalker and is reincarnated as one of Ai's newly born twins. To those who are just hearing that for the first time, I will pause for a moment to let those story beats sink in. I will give it absolutely points for shock value. A 1-hour opening premiere that has just about every twist you can imagine. The only thing I knew about the show going in was that it was about a pregnant idol, and I thought that was the big twist. And I was very wrong. The rest of the hour-long episode follows our newly born twins, who are named Aquamarine and Ruby. As a side note, the idea of Ai being about as terrible as naming her kids as the average teenager is very funny. Aqua, the boy, is our reincarnated doctor. Ruby is actually also a reincarnation of one of the doctor's former patients, an Ai superfan named Serena. Both of them experience these strange lives of being their favorite idol's babies while also having the minds and lived experiences of older people. But that's not all for twists. There is one more coming towards the end of the episode. Throughout the episode, we learn a bit more about Ai and about her life, how she was recruited to being an idol after a dark childhood, and how she's unsure if she herself is actually capable of love. Her greatest desire is to have a family, but she's also terrified of telling her children that she loves them because she's scared that if she says it out loud, she'll realize that it isn't true. The stalker who murdered the doctor makes a surprise reappearance on the night of Ai's big show and stabs and kills her on her doorstep. She holds Aqua as she dies and finally tells her children that she loves them. After her death, we see Aqua driven nearly mad with vengeance. The stalker killed himself shortly after murdering Ai, but Aqua is convinced that the father of her children, his father, is the person who pointed the stalker in their direction. He becomes determined to find this man and make him pay for Ai's death. The final few shots of the episode show him and Ruby, now teenagers who are entering high school, as we are promised that his plan to unravel the mystery will now begin. Now, as many problems as I already had, I have to admit this first episode had me hooked. I love a murder mystery thriller, and if I could ignore all of the sneaking suspicions I was already beginning to have about the show's tone, I was excited. Ai was a compelling character, which makes you, the viewer, almost as desperate as Aqua to find out what happened to her. Unfortunately, as I'll get into, that is not what Oshi no Ko does with its intriguing premise. Speaking of, I think it's about time I get into the plot of the rest of the show. You may be wondering why I divided it into two sections, the premiere and the rest, but I think there's a very clear reason for that. They feel like two completely different shows. For the remaining 10 episodes, we follow two plot lines: Aqua's search for answers and Ruby's goal to become an idol like their mother. Based on the premiere, it seems obvious which of these two should get more screen time. It's the idol plotline? We follow Ruby's search for members to join her idol group, while Aqua, who had a brief career as a child actor, continues his acting career in an attempt to find answers about Ai. One highlight of this half of the show is when Aqua stars in a reality show because we briefly return to the darker tone of that first episode. One of the girls on the show, a young actress named Akane, is driven to take her own life after she's viciously cyberbullied by the show's fans. Aqua saves her in the nick of time. Meanwhile, Ruby names her idol group after her mother's, and they begin performing. At the end of the season, they finally put on their first show to some success. And that's pretty much everything that happens. I'm glossing over some details, of course, like the many zany characters they meet on their journey through the entertainment industry, but ultimately, the biggest takeaway should be that I did not mention the murder mystery at all, because neither does the show. There's some lip service given to Aqua following up various trails throughout the season, but almost nothing actually happens. The rest of the season does not earn the goodwill that its shocking pilot gave it. Instead of being a detective thriller, as everything about it indicates, it's an idol show in a thriller hat. Aqua barely has 2 more clues in episode 11 than he did at the end of episode 1, and the murder mystery is a C-plot at best. Instead, I'm suddenly supposed to care about the school lives of these kids and Ruby's idol journey? Never mind the fact that Aqua's school life is undermined by the fact that I'm aware as the viewer that he's 40, and Ruby's is undermined by the fact that the show never actually bothered to make her interesting. The first episode builds up this really creepy and intense energy, and then the rest of the season just utterly wastes it. You might be thinking I'm being too harsh on the rest of the season, and I will admit that that might be true. I might have had a much more positive, or at least neutral, opinion of the rest of the season if it wasn't for that first episode. Because otherwise it's just a harmless idol show. I think I'd better start by going over the plethora of issues that I already had by the end of episode 1. Many of these could have been forgiven, or at least forgotten, if the rest of the show had played out differently, but as you're probably gathering by the fact that I'm making this video, it didn't. To begin with, our protagonist, a doctor in his late 20s, early 30s, is completely obsessed with teenage idol Ai Hoshino. This obsession is explained by the fact that he used to have a child patient, Serena, the girl who will later become his twin sister, who is an Ai superfan. He was quite attached to Serena, and she showed him Ai's performances. Then he kept up this support for Ai after Serena's death. However, there is no presumption here that the doctor's interest in Ai is a pure and innocent one. He immediately exhibits intense fan behavior and is called creepy, so I'm not sure we're meant to understand his love for Ai as a stand-in for his love for Serena, or maybe we are, but not in a good way.
16歳でしょその子。ロリコンですね。
I confess, if I hadn't heard glowing reviews of this show, I probably would have turned it off within the first 10 minutes. The doctor's obsession with Ai is treated as creepy within the show. I was like, this is our protagonist, this grown adult man who's obsessed with a teenage girl? But I wanted to give it a chance. The doctor's love of Ai, which is, in my opinion, almost explicitly sexual, undermines a lot of the show. The first example of this is with the doctor and Serena. While this could be a cute, sad backstory moment, the mix of the doctor being currently in love with the idol that Serena is obsessed with, while also comparing Ai to her,
彼女が好きだったアイドルとサリナちゃんを重ねて見てたんだろうな。
and while also featuring a proposal in the flashback scene,
社会的に死んじゃうから勘弁して。
このモラリスト。
残念だったな。16歳になったら真面目に考えてやるよ。
lends the entire thing an unsettling undertone, which the show also clearly recognizes because the nurse calls him a creep again after she hears about this backstory.
結果ロリコンってことですね。
話聞いてた?
Again as a joke, but the implication is there. This is also the beginning of every woman the Doctor/Aqua meets being in love with him, and I have to say we're not starting off strong with a 12-year-old who will later become his sister. From what I've heard about the manga, that particular relationship does not end there, but I'll leave that for you to tell me about in the comments. And speaking of the comments, because I'm sure a select few of you are preparing an essay for me, let me just say I have been watching anime for over 10 years pretty regularly. There's a certain degree of creepiness towards women and fan service that you just sort of have to be willing to tolerate in order to watch a lot of popular anime, not all of it, but a lot of it. And believe me, I have tolerated it. But the reason this show immediately gave me the ick was because it's grounded in reality. I've watched a million Minettas and Sanjis, and their pervertedness is usually played up as a comedic trait. We can debate whether or not that trait is problematic in another video, I think it is, but ultimately my point is that I know this drill, and this doesn't quite fit the bill. This is maybe the first example of the fact that Oshi no Ko wants to be two different shows. It wants to be an idol comedy, but it also wants to be a dark, twisted thriller. Perhaps it's my personal taste, but I would prefer it be the second one. But the big problem is that it can't choose. And in doing erotic comedy or falling into other anime tropes that we'll discuss later, it really undermines its more grounded thriller elements. How am I supposed to know how to react to anything in the show if the adult doctor who's obsessed with the teenager is played as comedy, but the stalker is a real dangerous threat? These characters can't properly coexist. The very premise also begins another one of the show's most consistent problems, which is that it does not recognize the unsettling elements of its own plot. While Ai is hiding from the world to give birth, she doesn't know that her doctor is also a fan of hers. While we understand that his professionalism prevents him from mentioning it, and it certainly would not have been better if he had, it does lend a creepy element to him taking care of her while she is under the impression that he has no idea who she is.
昔受け持った患者に君のファンがいたんだよ。
じゃあここならお医者さんもおじさんばかりでバレないと思ったんだけどな。
He has selfish motivations through her entire care, and she has no idea. That's unnerving to imagine about a medical professional that you're seeing. In his internal monologue, he even says that he's biased about what I should do medically because he's her fan.
医者としてはそうとしか言えないな。医者としては。
And here I'll go into my discussion of the baby premise. In order for the thriller story to work later, Aqua needs to be hyper-intelligent and motivated. An average 6-year-old probably wouldn't devote his entire life to revenge even if his mother was murdered in front of him, and he also probably wouldn't be very effective even if he did. And it also makes complete sense for Ai's children to be the protagonists of this story. The secret children of an idol, both of who develop a complicated relationship with show business and who want to continue their mother's legacy but can't ever really claim it. That's a good concept. It would be a shame if they wasted that potential. But what I do not understand is what about that premise requires Aqua to have been a doctor who was in love with Ai. And as I've said, it's not a pure, innocent love. He even makes comments about how he's basically living a fantasy, being a baby who's taken care of by his favorite idol. The sexual undertone is clearly there. It's wish fulfillment, sure, but what does that actually add to the story to have Aqua have been reincarnated? I have an alternate proposal that perhaps could have made a difference to me. What if Aqua, instead of being an adult in a child's body, is just a hyper-intelligent child? Could that not have served the exact same purpose in the story? And on top of that, if Aqua was a super intelligent child, we wouldn't have the issues of the fact that he's basically in love with his mother, and also of being an adult man who's acquiring an ever-growing harem of high school girls. Aqua is one of the biggest flaws of his own show. I wouldn't necessarily dislike him as a flawed character if that's the way that the show portrayed him, but the big issue is the show seems entirely unaware of how much he sucks. If this was all a grand critique of idol culture, I would be into it. Ai doesn't even get to have a real relationship with her children, which is her only wish. Instead, without her knowing it, she has 2 fans who are posing as her babies. I mean, how's that for critique? But that particular point is never brought up by the show. Aqua's true nature as an adult isn't treated as something that's meant to unsettle the audience when teenage girls are throwing themselves at him. And throw themselves at him they do. I mean, by the end of season 1, we've already got 2 teenage girls who are competing for his affections. But this is desirable in the eyes of the show, not creepy. He's a blank slate, an audience surrogate. He's someone we sit here and gasp when he does something cool. The fact that he's a doctor is also barely relevant, another reason why I don't understand why it was necessary. Instead, a lot of attention is given to his natural acting ability, which is yet another skill he acquires without ever having to try very hard. It would make him more likable if he had to struggle, but instead Aqua's just effortlessly good at whatever he needs to be good at without us ever getting any character development. In my opinion, Aqua is at his peak interesting during the reality TV arc. It's the only time the show ever really takes a moment to talk about how he's perceived by others. If he was genuinely the character that he pretends to be during that show, I would have been 1,000 times more invested in him. But instead, his only personality trait is just cool. For a protagonist, we get very little insight into his internal life. His not actually being young also undermines any emotional arc he could have. While I'm, of course, not trying to say that people over the age of 20 don't have emotions, although, of course, I haven't had them in years, there is a reason so many stories feature teenage protagonists. His quest for revenge without any thought to his personal well-being would be a lot more effective if he was a kid who the audience wants to see grow and learn. There's an inherent tragedy in a young person throwing their life away for vengeance, especially when we can see their desperation and their ignorance to the truths of the world. While I hesitate to give Black Butler points for anything, I will give them points for that. If you haven't seen it, it features a 12-year-old boy named Ciel who is seeking vengeance for his murdered parents. Over the course of the series, the tragedy of this premise becomes clear. This boy has no life of his own. He lives only to pursue vengeance, and like Hamlet, that pursuit will lead him nowhere good. For the record, Black Butler has a host of other problems, but that one arc at least is executed well. At least in season 1. I stand by my point about the fact that Aqua, having been Ai's doctor, serves no purpose, but you might be wondering about Ruby. Ruby is Aqua's sister, Serena's reincarnation. It's important that she have been Serena in her previous life because it gives her the motivation to become an idol. She was too sickly to do so in the first life where we knew her, but now she finally has the chance. This wouldn't work as her character motivation if she wasn't reincarnated. And to this, I have 2 counterpoints. One, other than the sweet vignette with her mother in the first episode, what does Ruby add to the show? Other than teasing her eventual spot in Aqua's harem, at least according to what I've heard about the manga, her existence really only gives him someone to talk to. Ruby could be an interesting character because she is essentially an optimist in a sea of pessimists. Even though her mother was murdered by a stalker, she wants to become an idol herself. And her idol group is clearly meant to be a parallel and counterpoint to Ai's group, even sharing the same name. Ruby's group is formed out of real friendship and in a bare-bones agency where the administration really truly cares about the girls. This is set in contrast to Ai's time as an idol, where she kept secrets from her agency and the other girls were very jealous of her. Ruby basically never experiences the drawbacks of the idol industry that this show is apparently critiquing. If you want those harsh criticisms, you'd better be content with the first episode. Ultimately, Ruby's group is meant to serve as a contrast to Ai's, but that's not actually what we dwell on in the series. Her group could essentially find a place in any other idol anime without much tweaking. Ruby's story is by far the weakest part of the series, and her character hasn't got 2 personality traits put together. In the end, she's just boring. So why are we rooting for her again? And also, could her having been sickly as a child not given her the exact same plotline? I yet again question why the reincarnation plot device was even necessary. Ultimately, this all feels like a twist for the sake of a twist and for some self-indulgent idol fantasy. Which, I mean, props to you if it floats your boat, but it just felt really out of place to me in this anime. In some ecchi anime, sure, a guy who's an idol superfan dies and gets reincarnated as her baby. But in this show, which gives the impression of being a grounded thriller drama, once again, I'm struck with the feeling of watching 2 conflicting shows. I also think that Akane, the bullied actress from the reality TV arc, is the most interesting supporting character, and I did actually like the arc surrounding her. That felt the closest to the pilot that the rest of the show ever got. But then it wasted the potential of that plotline by having her, like every other girl, just be into Aqua. And as soon as she falls for him, that's all she exists in the show to do. And now, finally, let's talk about the real star of the show, Ai Hoshino. As many have said before me, Ai is a fascinating character. She feels like the protagonist, and that does make it an interesting choice to kill her off at the end of the first episode. In this way, I think the hour-long episode really works. It gives us time to get to know this girl, her skills and flaws, and really understand her as human. She is more than what the audience sees in her. The public persona is not Ai herself, it is a carefully calculated performance. And then we kill her. And the only people who are left behind are people who barely knew her true self at all. While Aqua knows some things about her, he never seems to even get a glimpse of the girl that we met during the idol recruitment meeting. He's too blinded by his love for her as a fan to see her as a person. And while killing her off in the first episode is certainly very shocking and quite sad, I'm not sure that the show ever really earns that shock. I don't think that the show really comes back from her death. Instead of feeling how clever it was to kill Ai off so early, I was instead just kind of left wishing that the rest of the show was still about her. It's like if, spoilers for a show that came out nearly 20 years ago, if in Death Note they had killed off L in episode 1 and then the rest of the show was just about Mello and Nier. It's fascinating to have a show that seems to understand the problems of the entertainment industry so well and yet fall into those same pitfalls. In one breath, it critiques those who are dangerously obsessed with idols, and then has its protagonist exhibit many of those same tendencies. It shows that Ai is more than she's publicly perceived, and yet does not allow us to know more about her, nor experience Aqua getting to know her better. It shows the unhealthy and even dangerous nature of the idol industry, and yet lauds Ruby for wanting to follow in her mother's footsteps. Of course, the questions that the show is raising don't have simple answers, but it also seems entirely uninterested in interrogating the questions that it itself is raising. So instead, much like Ai's death at the end of the first episode, we're left imagining the ghost of what the show could have been if it had followed through on some of its more interesting concepts. So that's my rambling, irritated thoughts on Oshi no Ko. I did binge the entire season because of its very addictive qualities, but after a couple of episodes I just was wondering, when does this get good again? And for anyone who wondered the same thing, I just have one recommendation for you. Go watch Perfect Blue instead. Bye!